this is the start of the second round of presentations. And unfortunately, one of the presenters is ill, so he's not going to be presenting. But our first speaker is Jane Carlin. She is Library Director at the University of Puget Sound in Washington. She's worked as an art librarian in many universities and has completed postgraduate work at the University of Wales. Her thesis, A History of Art Book Publishing, the Great Britain, has served as the foundation for many classes and programs associated with the history of the book and artist books. She is Vice President of the Puget Sound Book Artists Association and has curated numerous exhibitions associated with artist books with an emphasis on social justice issues. Her talk is titled Artist Books as Catalysts of Social Change.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. When I read the program and realized I was the first speaker after lunch and that Britain was having a heat wave, I decided that maybe a little icebreaker would be appropriate. So I think it's always nice to let people know where I've come from, and how many of you might be wondering, where in the world is Puget Sound? So Puget Sound is located near Seattle, Washington, and the University of Puget Sound is in Tacoma, Washington, which is 30 miles. We might be a 9.5-hour flight and over 4,800 miles away from England, but there are quite a few connections. So I thought I might share some of those with you. So that mountain is the iconic Mount Rainier. That photograph was taken by Ross Mulhausen, our campus photographer. And yes, it's 1 mile from my office. And in the University of Puget Sound, we have a phrase that we have to live like the mountains out, because like Britain, it's often foggy and gray. My library, the Collins Library, is depicted there, and that library and our entire campus at the University of Puget Sound is designed after Magdalen College in Oxford, because our early president in the 1920s, George Thompson, went to school in Oxford, and he came back to the Pacific Northwest and said, I'm going to recreate that Oxford University. Now, the 3 images on the bottom row show a little bit more connection, and just keep this in mind because this will really circle around to a social justice issue. The image right here, does anybody know who that is? That is George Vancouver, who charted the northwest coast of North America from 1791 to 1795. And as part of that expedition, he sent a lieutenant, Peter Puget, out in a longboat to survey the waters. And he was so impressed with Peter Puget's map-making skills that he deemed the body of water that you see depicted in front of Mount Rainier would be called Puget Sound. So that's how we got our name. And that middle image is from a historical website. Peter Puget is married in a small village outside of Bath. And in 1966, a delegation from Seattle, Tacoma came to Britain to honor Peter Puget. And the third image is of Peter Rainier. Who knew there'd be so many Peters in our connection? Peter Rainier was also a member of the Royal Navy. And when George Vancouver looked at the mountain, known to the native Puyallup speakers as Mount Tahoma, which is how Tacoma got its name, he decided he wouldn't call it Mount Tahoma, he would call it Mount Rainier, after his close personal friend, Peter Rainier, who I understand never stepped foot on North American soil. So just a few tidbits about where I'm from. But I am going to talk about artist books as catalysts of social change. And in the preparatory marks for this talk, I did mention that from the moment Gutenberg's Bible was set to print, books have played a role in shaping society, and the enduring legacy of the book as a powerful vehicle for social transformation is just as significant today as it was over 500 years ago. I strongly believe artist books can be powerful catalysts for social change and provide art libraries and art librarians the opportunity to be leaders in their campus and in their community, to contribute to dialogues of diversity, inclusion, and social justice. I believe artist books can be used to help foster a safe space for respectful discussion and introduce principles of compassionate communication. In my presentation today, I hope I can inspire you to consider ways to use artist books outside of the studio environment to promote those courageous conversations in the classroom and the community. Now, those of us that deal with collections, whether they're standard monographs or artist books or some of the wonderful collections that were mentioned this morning, we all know each and every item deserves a presentation unto itself. But I can't talk about each and every book, but I do want you to know I have created a website. I'll give you the URL with a full list of image descriptions, links to the artist's website, as well as citation information for you at the end of this presentation. Pictured here are two books that I use quite a bit in community engagement sessions with student groups and classes. Both Clarissa Sly's book, Transforming Hate, and Katie Delaney's book are used in classes that I've taught on bullying, race, ethnicity, sexual preference, and women's issues. So my goals today are pretty simple, and to be honest, the last session, I was like, wow, this is exactly what I'm doing. So it's a nice segue into all the metacognition concepts that were discussed earlier today. I want to talk about how artist books can be used to serve as powerful personal narratives and to demonstrate how we can engage in conversations, as well as to show how art librarians can raise the profile. The two books that are pictured here are by a Portland, Oregon-based artist named Laura Russell. And Laura has done quite a bit of work with the homeless community in Portland. Of course, this is a worldwide crisis throughout all of our cities. Bless This House is a book that talks about the abolishment of a mobile home park and the displacement of over 250 families. Laura spent months photographing and talking with the families. And Anything Helps is a book that Laura did in collaboration with members of the homeless community in Portland, where she actually went out into the community, talked to homeless individuals, and worked with them to take their signage and recreate it in a book, which is in the form of a wallet. Laura's work is listed on a website for a gallery called 23 Sandy Gallery, and many of the books that I'll be highlighting today are available through 23 Sandy, as well as the book dealers Vamp and Tramp in the United States, and can be acquired here in Great Britain. To set the context of the work I do with artist books, I'd like to share a few comments on the context of higher education and the role that art librarians can play in enhancing the student experience. As a library director, I constantly feel the pressure to demonstrate the value of the library. And I'm sure that many of you here today have been challenged by budget cuts, rising costs, and the changing priorities of higher education. It's essential that librarians communicate their value to the community they serve and to their institutional stakeholders. Whether you like that phrase, return on investment, or not, we are under pressure to demonstrate how we enhance the learning experience of our students. I strongly believe that art librarians can take a very active role in the academic community and the community around your universities by showing the value of how our collections can help engage students in critical conversations and also reinforce all those learning goals that our universities, whether in the US or UK, are adapting, such as critical thinking, discovery of interdisciplinary connections, and of course, very importantly, deep meaning and reflection. As this word cloud reflects, issues of privilege, gender equality, racism, immigration, migration, and many more are all issues that our society must address. And our current generation of students are actively engaged in social justice movements and are demanding that our universities, our communities, and our governments address diversity and inclusion. But I think everybody in the room knows this is not easy work. Often these are difficult conversations to have, especially when you have students and faculty that are coming from very different socioeconomic backgrounds. For example, at the University of Puget Sound, which is a small, academically select, expensive liberal arts college, many of our students come from a position of privilege and wealth. The concept of white privilege has never even entered their minds. But our university, like many colleges across the land, is trying to diversify. There's sometimes a clash when you bring students from privilege and students that are first-generation college students that may have absolutely no support system at home together. So how can we use artist books to help foster these difficult conversations? So my presentation today is really reflecting on how we can take the artist books out of the art studio and into the curriculum and into the community, integrating with curriculum, with cultural competency sessions that you can do for staff across all disciplines at your universities, and partnerships with community organizations and exhibits. Well, we heard this morning about the questioning of students and how students work with materials and how sometimes students might find it difficult to respond to the artist book or the archive. So what I do is really a very simple but very effective manner of working with students. And when we think about the changing demographics of our communities, the different life experiences that our students have, and the difficulty of confronting social issues head-on, I use a combination of individual reflection and small group discussion, which provides a framework for engagement. As I aforementioned, I do this in staff development sessions, in community forums within Tacoma and the surrounding community, and also integrated into the classroom. And this process of using personal individual reflection, then group discussion, and then bringing all the small groups together into one conversation is really very, very effective. And I generally work with students and ask several prompts, and these prompts have been developed with educators from our School of Education. So working with students, they would come into our archives classroom, we would have the books on display, and I know earlier we talked about maybe not spending so much time on what is an archive, what is an artist book, and why should we care. But I have the books represented on tables. The students come in, spend about 15 minutes looking at the books, and then they're all asked to settle at a table with one or two books that speak to them. And then the students respond together to these prompts. I don't have the colophon statement from the artist available, but I do have it on a sheet of paper face down, so if students are really having difficulty starting that conversation. But I've used this technique in all different age groups and in different settings, and it's been very, very effective. And just recently, I learned that this approach parallels a technique that is often used in family therapy called reflective structured dialogue. Using this method, the participant engages with the artist's books and reflects upon the content and then engages in a group discussion. And I was thinking about the research habits of students now that we have the internet and all our databases online, and many times our students come into an information literacy session and they just start typing on the computer and they're not really thinking and formulating the questions. So this is a way to stop, reflect, and think about what you're doing. And my intended result is not to change individuals' perceptions or their opinions, but rather to have them listen deeply and engage in a conversation to try to understand different points of view. The artist book becomes the object, the artifact, the means that help foster the conversation. And we know that these conversations are very difficult, especially when you have two different points of view. So we've used these artist books in conversations about gun control, about marriage rights, about abortion. And that's really taken the pressure off the individual to respond because they can look at the book and start to think about how the artist responded. So I'd like to highlight just a few of the collaborations that we've done and also highlight some of the books that we have in our collection. I've been an architecture and design librarian my entire career, but 8 years ago I transitioned, some say to the other side, the dark side. I became a university library administrator, and it was really interesting to enter an environment where artist books had never been seen before. But I was convinced that we could integrate them and use them in our community. Something I've been very proactive with, and again, I think this raises the profile of the art librarian, is that we can go out into our community and engage with publishers, with museums, with community activist organizations. So this is profiles an event that I worked with a local museum as well as the publishers of Yes Magazine, which is a popular magazine published in the Northwest that addresses social justice issues. We paired that with discussions about immigration and migration. So this is a book that recognizes the loss of identity taking place in contemporary Europe due to mass immigration. We also had this book, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, by Philip Zimmerman, that comments on the complicated attitudes of Americans on illegal immigration, and it's meant to be read aloud as it chronicles the 24 hours of a migrant's life crossing the border. And we also coupled it with a series of broadsides. So I made a conscious decision when I became library director that we would not only collect artist books and zines, but also broadsides. This is a series of broadsides called Migration Now from an organization called Just Seeds that pairs graphic artists with social justice issues. So we had all these materials out with a community who had never seen artist books or had been exposed to broadside. We used those prompts that I showed you in the previous slide, and we had a very engaged discussion. Just Seeds is promoted and sponsored by Brooklyn, which happens to be in Brooklyn, so don't get confused. But Brooklyn is an organization that supports contemporary, diverse, international book artists and zine artists. And the organization's founder, Marshall Weber, is someone that I've gotten to know over the last couple of years. And it's really interesting because he's an advocate of shifting the academic dialogue away from the antiquarian, Anglo-centric special collections that many of us have to content-based contemporary work by diverse international artists. So I've been really lucky to work with Marshall to think about ways that we can start to show voices in our collection that have not been heard before. And just as a sidebar, I did a publication analysis of my collection at the University of Puget Sound. And we kind of 1930s, 40s, 50s, peaks in the 60s, goes kind of down. But reflect about the canon of scholarly knowledge that we all represent in our libraries and how many of us or how many librarians that came before us collected materials from those organizations and groups that were marginalized. So Brooklyn's a great resource to go to. As an educator, I also try to connect current and local events with the artist books. So as educators, we all know that it's much more meaningful to a student if we can find an experience that appeals to their real world. Now, the University of Puget Sound had students in the 1940s that were sent to the Japanese internment prison camps. This small accordion book called Executive Order 9066 is a personal narrative of a family that was sent to one of the internment camps. And we couple that with original materials from our archives. So that notice to Japanese citizens is a broadside that was placed around the United States in 1942 when the Japanese were rounded up and sent to internment camps. So that's always a very motivating force for students to see the historical document, but then to see a contemporary personal reflection. Speaking Volumes, Transforming Hate is an extraordinary exhibit of the artist Clarissa Sly. This is a really amazing show in which the Holter Museum in Montana asked a group of 65 artists to transform thousands of anti-Semitic and racist books into an uplifting exhibition. The museum received the white supremacist material from a defector and worked with the Montana Human Rights Network to recreate these books into objects of beauty. Clarissa Sly is an African-American artist who is now in her mid-70s, so she grew up in North Carolina during a period of intense discrimination. And she writes about that experience and in her book, which is still in print and available. But she says, we make decisions about who gets to have rights and who is marginalized in our society. From the place I stand, I can see the courage and strength of my grandmother and mother and the path they made for me. I ask the viewer to question his or her perceptions about history, reality, and identity. So this is a really powerful book to use with students, and we actually asked the Holter Museum if we could have copies of the white supremacist materials. I have to admit my provost was a little worried about, what was happening over there in the library because we were actually going to catalog white supremacist materials, but we felt it was really important to have these there. This is a recent book by an artist named Ginger Burrell. This is another example how artists are responding to social issues. The alarming events in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia shocked our campus and I think the entire world last year, and students wanted to talk about it. So this is a book in which the artist claims that she looks at the direct and indirect messages from President Donald Trump to white nationalists. And while he frequently claims ignorance of such a movement, his behavior and language tell another story. So this book was used in conversations about racism. This is one of 3 books by an artist named Ann Tyler that deals with lynching, not an easy topic to talk about. And I'm going to circle back to our historical legacy. The Japanese internment is an example of how we're looking back onto history and saying, how could we do that? Think of Peter Rainier and Peter Puget and George Vancouver, who did not listen or take any notice of the local Puyallup or Salish Native Americans. So we're re-examining our history and thinking in new ways. This book is a very, very powerful book because not only is the story woven around an English children's tale about a rabbit stealing a turnip, but the actual viewing of the book forces the individual to pick up instruments of torture, so they're somewhat complicit in the whole idea of lynching. On a more humorous kind of but sad note, I did want to share this with you. A local Tacoma artist named Jessica Spring created this book called Trump and Judy, and it's about our president. And I don't know if you can read that, but I think I have a little extra time, don't I? A pompous man rode into town, bloated, orange, and such a clown, given his throne by the Electoral College, lacking voters and factual knowledge. His campaign revealed the real Mr. Trump, such vitriol on women he continues to dump. And then, of course, you can pull the little tab, and I don't think I'll repeat that. But we've used this book in conversations about politics, fake news, the state of affairs in the United States. Jessica Spring is on the left, and she is also working with another local artist, Chandler Leary, in which they've created an incredible broadside series called The Dead Feminists. And this series provides a new and illuminating look at women who have changed history. And what's great about the broadsides is they're almost like a research project on a page. So I think all of us are struggling too to find ways to appeal to our students. As a library director, I often say, oh no, not another research paper. Students want to make websites, they want to do broadsides, they want to make their own books. So Chandler and Jessica were kind enough to let me bring several of the postcards of their series, and they're up here at the front, and I encourage you to take some with you. Very quickly, I indicated working with local museums, local groups. We hosted a Book Power Redo exhibit that dealt with social justice. I hosted the Al-Mutanabbi Street exhibit, which I think traveled here in the UK. And most recently, we did a collaboration with scientists, poets, and artists on dirt. So I know someone earlier today was talking about the connections between science and art. So these were other ways that we engaged our community. And projects like this also help with the experiential real world learning goals that we have now. So students are learning skills to curate, to create the labels, and to be more involved in the exhibit. And then finally, I'm going to conclude, probably the most effective and meaningful class from my point of view has been working with students in the College of Education. Our master's students take a capstone class about cultural competency. And we all know as educators that when a current event happens, it's very hard to go into lecture and talk about your subject. You want to address that current event. So the cultural competency class that our students take is to help students deal with diverse populations, to handle difficult situations, and be prepared to address current events no matter what the subject is. So all of the books that I've shown you in this presentation have been used with our students in education. And I just wanted to share some of the impact and reflection statements, because I think for me as an educator, the fact that the students are really thinking deeply about these subjects as a result of interaction with the books is really wonderful, and I think their testimonials show that. And I'll just conclude with a few pictures. Tunnel Books as a personal narrative. This was a class for students who have never stepped into an art studio. And they were asked to make a tunnel book to reflect a personal narrative. The one on the top is a student of Japanese American ancestry who grew up in a home where her parents did not discuss or reflect her ancestry. And it was only when she began dating at college and meeting a Japanese American individual that she realized that she had a missing gap in her personal history. And so she made this tunnel book. And the book on the bottom is a young woman who was a victim of sexual abuse, and she was very affected by the Me Too movement and also referenced the classic story of Medusa. The Teacher's Guide to Management, Gender Difference Edition, a great book that a student made about dealing with gender differences in the classroom. And I was so proud of her because she did that triple accordion fold and she'd never made a book before. So often in these classes that I'm doing with students, I'll also bring books in from our circulating collection that are books about book design and bookmaking. Here's another book in which a student talked about objectification. She was very concerned about how people perceive the way she dresses. So I thought using the paper doll motif and Velcro, and again, these are students that have never made a book before. So when we're talking about creativity, I think we can really see that artist books can spur that creativity. And I'll conclude my remarks with a book that's particularly meaningful to me. This book is called Lipstick on a Pig. I think that's an expression that's familiar here. Of course, it's saying that you can't take anything superficial or cosmetic changes or futile attempts to disguise the true nature of a product or person. Kyle was a young man whose parents rented property in Tacoma and violated social justice by not renting to underrepresented or minoritized populations. And he grew up in that home. and he grew up with those values. And it was only after being in teacher training and after the session with the artist's books that he began to think about his socialization. I'd like to read a quote from his book. "Developing into adults is a complex and dynamic process. Within this process is our socialization. Influencing how we think and act is a series of conscious and subconscious information that flows directly from those we love and trust. But how often do we consider our past in an attempt to understand our present and to create a better future? This artist's book is my attempt at a reflective process. Through an analysis of my socialization, I ask myself meaningful questions to better understand my future teaching. Hopefully, this reflective analysis of my socialization challenges you to do the same." Pretty powerful. And so in conclusion, I hope I've inspired you to think of the artist's book as a catalyst of social change and take the books out of the studio and into the classroom and to the community. These opportunities demonstrate the relevance of our collections and the power of the art librarian, as well as promote the enduring legacy of the book. Indeed, artist books are catalysts of social change. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. So we'll have questions after the last speaker, which is Adele Patrick. So she's speaking on, her talk is called Art and Activism in the Archive, Creative Thinking and Radical Acts in the Making of Glasgow Women's Library.
So thanks again for having me here. Although this is a bit of a flying visit, it's just been enormously worthwhile already being part of this fantastic group of people. So in the next 25 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit. I know that there are some people in the room who know about the Women's Library, but I thought I might give a little bit of an idea of where we're at just now, a little snapshot about what we do and why we do it. And I want to talk a little bit today about how radical acts of one sort or another, different methods of working, and the agency of artists have combined to create what is a unique organisation in the UK. And I want to touch upon 3 projects. One is a sort of blueprint, really, for the way that we work with artists. And I want to also sort of mention a couple of other projects that I think illustrate different types of ways that we connect collections with creatives and with audiences. And finally, I want to sort of provide a little bit of an illustration of our vexed questions, thinking at the moment about how a collecting strategy, so a feminist collecting strategy, is being developed in the library, and how creatives, as well as collections professionals and people who have got different degrees of access to cultural capital, are going to be informing this process of community collecting. So the Women's Library, Glasgow Women's Library, is a recognised collection of national significance. It collects and shows art. It has archives and museum objects, and it's a lending and reference library, a free space, free to borrow, free to use, and so on. It delivers really groundbreaking programmes in an award-winning building in the heart of Glasgow's East End, in an area that's within the 5% of the most deprived areas in Scotland. This year, improbably, it became a finalist in the Art Fund's Museum of the Year, and we're taking that as recognition for innovation and exceptional achievement in 2017. The library has developed from the grassroots, from a grassroots women's arts project founded in 1991. And in the period from 2012, it's undergone a period of really rapid, accelerated growth and heightened sort of public profile. As I mentioned, it's a unique organisation, it's values-led resource, and at the moment it's the sole accredited museum of women's history in the UK. Glasgow Women's Library is something of a misnomer. We work across Scotland, we work with a lot of UK and international partners. We're open to all, and we're very much more than a library, which I hope this will become apparent. So we're really thriving in this context at the moment where the discussions about activists, archivists and radical librarianship are super febrile and fertile at the same time. Our engagement with equality, diversity and inclusion is holistic. It impacts on every aspect of our work, strategic and operational. So equality, diversity and inclusion impacts on the way that we think about governance in the organisation, programming, collecting, communications, recruitment, all these areas. And it's evident in things like our classification system, which is a feminist classification system. And unfortunately, the librarian's not here today. She could talk for days about this, and I know it divides the room. Some people are extremely interested in classification systems, and others not so. But to the extent that we can be read as activists, archivists, and so on and so forth, I suppose it's most clearly expressed in a recent document that we published that was around, it's called Equality in Progress. You can download it on our website. And it's really looking at an analysis, structural, institutional, attitudinal, about how inequalities are still being expressed in many of the institutions, specifically museums, in Scotland and beyond. But I think in terms of theoretical underpinnings, we're really thinking here about conceptualizations in terms of activism, archives, of Kate Eichhorn and her archival turn in feminism. It's a really significant document for us in thinking about the way that we work within our specific context. But I want to sort of mention some of the things that I think make it different from academic libraries and also mainstream libraries or those that are maybe still grassroots. Our organisation is now employing 24 people, so it's sort of slightly different from both of those types of ways of working that characterise other women's libraries, archives and museums. And our space has some rare characteristics in that the senior managers, myself and the other manager in the library, are trained artists and designers. We're not collections professionals. And creatives have invested in the Women's Library's development from the very outset. I think over the last 10 years, we're doing a survey of, or a sort of reflection on the agency of artists and the organisation's history. And over the last 10 years, we've worked with 300 creatives. So that's sort of indicative of the way that we work with artists. It's not a couple of residences every other year or whatever. It's driven, the whole organisation's driven by an authentically felt and articulated belief across the team in this idea of equality, diversity and inclusion. So for over a decade, it's supported, the library's supported in-house literacy provision, Black and minority ethnic development, and daily ESOL classes, so English as a second language classes. And we are regarded as a pioneer in diversifying museum audiences. Just a little about why we started doing what we're doing. Need I say more? Well, maybe I do have to say more. We were seeded in a feminist creatives collective response to a really overdetermined, masculinised cultural canon in Glasgow in the 1980s, and specifically to the idea that the new Glasgow boys that you can see here should be the standard bearers of Glasgow's then arts-led regeneration in the lead up to Glasgow becoming European City of Culture in 1990. So obviously there'd been the 19th century Glasgow boys, and as 1990 came around, a new minted idea about who was going to be representing Glasgow to a European local audience was being coined, not in an ironic way. So it was the Glasgow boys, and that's what you're going to get type of thing. So we reacted to that. This was an activist radical moment of saying, no, Glasgow and Scottish culture can be represented in other ways. And this was our first women's library home. It grew out of an even more rootsy organisation called Women in Profile. But the library certainly was a voluntary project for its first decade. And as I say, we're now employing 24 staff. We support about 100 volunteers. But there's still very much that connects those that represent the library now and the communities that we work with. And our team includes and champions the so-called hard to reach, or as we prefer to say, the easy to ignore. And the development of our posts, interestingly, started with what would be called access. So our very first workers were LGBTQ plus people working with the Lesbian Archive collection. Then we employed Black and minority ethnic development worker, we employed lifelong learning, adult literacy, and some decade later, the first collections professional. And I think it's quite interesting that we still only have, I'm sure you're going to be really appalled at me, but we still only have a part-time librarian and a part-time museum curator. We are addressing this. But I suppose it gives an idea of the balance when you think about other mainstream collections that tend to have collections heavy and so on and so forth, and maybe a little siloed area where access and outreach, or whatever organisations choose to call it, happening. In 2014, following relocation into our first permanent premises, our collections became accessible and we gained fit-for-purpose space to show work. So to give you an idea, the library houses 200,000 archive items from posters to zines, badges, placards, so on and so forth, 300 museum objects, crossover there obviously, but from fine artworks, works by craft makers, designers, suffragette memorabilia, so on and so forth. And it's got well over 20,000 books in its landing and reference library. And we've developed as well lots of digital resources. Significantly, every item has been donated. So that it does mark it as slightly different feel when you go into the library, and certainly a different degree of ownership to the collection. We've never had an acquisitions or stock budget. We've got 3 cultural and feminist aims: to create a sustainable, accessible space where historical and contemporary works, including books by and about women, can be conserved, collected and shown; to uncover, spotlight and display the frequently erased, neglected historical cultural contributions of women, in the main through collaborative, innovative programmes, often with women creatives, and to encourage and nurture contemporary makers, trying to act as a crucible for diverse work and to inspire cultural, social and economic capital of women. So we connect with artists of all different stripes in complex, radical, productive ways. And at the same time, their agency helps us not just to sort of develop the environment of the library, which I'm going to go on to sort of speak about a little bit, but helps us to continually question, recreate, and redetermine who and what we are. So the programs that we deliver combine, and there's a few sort of like literal hard copy programs there, if anybody's interested to know more, combine culture and collections in innovative ways. So we've developed projects and online resources and publication on hate crime, as I mentioned, on LGBTQ LGBTI+ issues on sex, sexuality, domestic abuse, frequently in collaboration with artists. And we support and benefit from lots of residencies, commissions, and paid internships each year. And obviously, the work that we support is more often than not participatory. So it's been critical, because of the way that we want to work with artists and work with our communities, that we're sitting at a pivot between and have ongoing partnerships with academic institutions, obviously the library, archives and museums sectors, but critically the voluntary sector and other campaigning and other organisations. So we work with Rape Crisis, we work with homelessness charities, we work with organisations that are supporting actions against racism, homophobia, transphobia, and so on and so forth. So for local audiences, our library offers life-changing, genuinely life-changing opportunities to meaningfully engage with culture. And I suppose the blueprint that I wanted to mention about us working with visual artists was sort of forged really in work. It actually says 2014 there, but it really started in 2012 when we started working on a project called 21 Revolutions. Lots of different facets, but in essence, we invited 21 artists and 21 writers to make a new work inspired by our collections. And typically, we took the opportunity to invite emerging and established creatives, knowing what happens when people get into a room and they can support each other and informal mentoring can take place and so on and so forth. But all the artists and the writers generated really remarkable works that are in our collection, but we're also hugely interested in generating income and not relying on local and national government funding. So we asked the artist up front, can they make 21 prints that we can keep a print for our collection and we can sell the rest. So I think we must have sold about well over 100 grand's worth of prints. But the works are remarkable, including works that were inspired by books about art, about artists, but also about museum and archive objects too. And the works that were generated by writers you can access on our website. You can hear the writers reading their texts as podcasts. So that's Jackie Kay, A.L. Kennedy, Muriel Gray, lots of people that you may well know about. One of the things I wanted to mention before moving on is just that this typified really in works that were created by, say, an artist like Claire Barclay, was that the artists reinterpreted almost like chemistry with the collection, and their research within the collections helped us understand the way that certain texts could be used and illuminated a way that the text might be read by them and by others. So, for example, Claire Barclay's interrogation of the feminist, early first-wave feminist text, Just Suffragi, although this work speaks to Emily Wilding Davidson, really made me more aware of the convergence of Nazism and suffragette history as well. You know, so I mean, it's not something that you want to dwell on necessarily, but you know, just the way that artists work really helps us to understand better what we have. Thank you. So, yeah, other elements to do with 21 Revolutions was that we developed a publication, please buy it, please order it, it's amazing, that includes all the works, but also gives you much more of an idea about the items that inspired the interest, the works by the artists. We exhibited the exhibition at the CCA, the Centre for Contemporary Arts, at the Royal Scottish Academy, and it's also, the works have been bought in public collections, including the City Art Collections in Sheffield and Liverpool, and obviously Glasgow Gallery of Modern Art. But this sort of model of really unleashing artists and other creators in the collection has generated other remarkable work. So last year, for example, I just wanted to speak briefly about a couple of fabby works, and one is a new body of work, a new fantastic exhibition by the artist Hannah Leighton Boyce. And the works that you can see here, if you can imagine, these are in a circular formation on the floor. And I do think it's a work of genius, because this is about salt and lead and this fabulous alchemical magical thing that happens when you've got water and electricity formed. And it still boggles my mind that you can just see up there the sort of light source that's been created by salt and water and lead and so on. But this was generated by Hannah being in our space and seeing the way that a central round table in the library space is used by literacy learners, is used by different women converging. And actually her choice to focus on salts, which you can see in this next work as well, these are almost like salt pillars, originated from her crying as a result of hearing a woman, an older woman, deciding to sort of learn to read and hear in that process of her actually developing her literacy in the library space. But she speaks about the circular spaces, linking it to the table of sentiments on which the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 was drafted at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, and this sort of relationship of circles and space and salt and so on to the space. I'm going to rattle on. So as I say, Leighton Boyce here was typically responding to the specificities of our space, the specificities of the diverse people encountered within it, and to the records that she was working with in her residency. And more recently, some of you may well have noticed that as part of Glasgow International Festival of Visual Arts, we invited a new commission by the artist Linda Sterling, and this fulfilled our ambition to put a flagpole on the front of the building first, and animate the foyer with a new work by a really fabulous woman artist. And you have to think about this in the context of our space, which is in the white heat. It's almost like located right in the middle of almost like the area that's most charged with sectarianism in Scotland. Just to say that there are more sectarian marches in our area than there are in the whole of the Northern Ireland in a year. So a couple of weeks ago, I arrived at the library and all the pavements were painted red, white and blue. There were red Hand of Ulster flags all over the streets. So this has got a certain valence, it's got a certain freighted relationship to our locale. I'm not going to speak too much about it. You can check out, I think there's an article on Front Row on BBC website about this and so on. But Linda worked really productively with both the archive materials, making both the flag and this remarkable film called Bower of Bliss that was installed in the foyer of the space. She was really thinking about the movement from the outside world of visitors into this incredible, wonderful space that is the Women's Library. Anyway, you can read all about that. The work relates to work that she's also doing at Improbably at Chatsworth. So she was actually trying to make a connection between the collections at Chatsworth House and the Women's Library, which is mind-boggling but fabulous. So finally, what I wanted to speak about just very briefly, and it's more like open questions that I'm hoping that we could maybe pick up in our discussion, is really about the way that we've evolved our collection. So it's been evolved through the relationships with artists and with arts champions. It's really led to sort of like a whole swathe of unsolicited ad hoc gifts of works. And these have been sort of increasing in recent years. So we've acquired some really significant artworks this year alone, including a wonderful art film by the artist Kate Davis called Charity, prints by Kira Phillips and others. And obviously acquiring things as a consequence of commissions, like this work here, hoardings outside our building, residences, and the continual involvement, the ebb and flow, breathing in and breathing out of artists within our neighbourhood and our locale and in our community. So people giving us things and creating things for us and so on. So we find ourselves with quite a significant load of work. This is our librarian. So Wendy Kirk. So over the last 18 months, we've been involved in a project called the Curatorial Leadership in Collecting in Scotland. And this almost like opportunity for reflection on what we're doing has come at really a critical time in our history. Just at a point when it feels possible that we might have some money to acquire something, we feel a degree of responsibility to sort of think, well, what would you buy? You know, what if you're a women's library, and how would you go about choosing that? And what would be a feminist approach to collecting? So we've been keen to learn from colleagues who are also working to problematise and innovate across the terrains of community curating and community collecting of high quality art, but who want to change the relationship of curators as distinct from access specialists, who are risk-taking around the formerly siloed areas of community and high art making. So we're coming to the end of the first phase of that. And following 21 Revs that I've mentioned, our relationship with internationally renowned artists and our role fostering emerging talent has sort of like deepened. We're a grown-up organisation now. We've got different type of relationship with artists, and our capacity to exhibit and acquire works has improved in the way that I've mentioned. So in terms of our own collection, we're seeing it in a new light now. It's hybrid in terms of the disciplines and genres that we've got, and we've had to acknowledge that growing without a policy, it nonetheless represents, to a degree, specific relationships that we've had over the years, but also very particular ways that we've had relationships with people. So women who can afford to give us work, or women who have got a feminist analysis of their gifting work to us, women who are confident about collections and understand what they're doing there, artists whose work we might not ever show, but we felt we should accept. You know, so all these sort of like difficult things we're starting to think about in a bit more critical way. So at this stage in our development, we're aiming to shift from a very reactive position that we've had for 27 years, where we've relied on unsolicited ad hoc donations in the way that I've mentioned, to trying to grow a collection in a more proactive, strategic way. And this applies to our artist book collection and to our books generally, trying to be more aware of the processes that inhibit giving or can shape our collection in ways that we feel more not in control of, but in a more responsive dialogue with our learners and users and audiences and so on. So we want to enable radical and impactful engagement with communities of stakeholders in curating and collecting. CLIC, this community curating project, has enabled us to be involved in more focused discussion with and learning from critical friends, and I want to sort of extend that conversation with you today, and want to be open to questions about art, about collecting, about ethics and equality. So some of the things we've been thinking about are, what are the benchmark projects for community collecting, and also art libraries? How might they function in a context like the Women's Library? How can these collections be seen to be in dialogue with the texts that we have, these new art collections? How can they activate even further the library collection? Who might constitute the community that can drive collecting at GWL? How can artists be involved in the process, but also those that have no cultural capital or no formal cultural capital. So we have a project called Seeing Things, where people just come to the library and then go out and see things with us. And we focus on people who've not even used our local library or never been to a local museum. And we go and see fabulous art together. I want them involved. But I also want maybe members of our board who are like, I don't like that art. No, like there are people on our board who are totally savvy about art, but also people on our board who need to have their cultural literacy developed, as we all do. So what might the processes for collecting work at this point in our history in this unique institution be? As a feminist organisation working in this milieu, this political, local, national and international milieu, how could we aspire to do the type of work that you're doing, Jen, and actually make it a meaningful process? I think I'll leave it at that, if that's okay.
So it's just following on from what you were saying, really, about collecting, because that's kind of my question as well, is how do you go about, Jane, as well, how do you go about what artist books do you collect? How do you collect them? And I was also wondering what kind of budget you had at your university for collecting them, because I don't know if that dictates what you select, or if you just have a huge budget so you can buy everything. I don't know. So, maybe if we could just continue the conversation about collecting, that would be...
Well, I would say at the University of Puget Sound, when I arrived, we didn't have an artist book collection. So part of my job as the library director was to be somewhat respectful of the collecting patterns that have existed at the university, but also examine what our university values were and where the curriculum was going. We wanted to focus on books that represented the Pacific Northwest artists. Particularly in the area of Seattle-Tacoma, we have quite a few letterpress printers. We have a large book arts community. I had worked at an art and design school previously, so I had very good connections with artist book vendors and dealers, and I knew artists. In terms of the budget, I'm the steward of the university's money, so the way our budget is delegated, I have the university funds to purchase library materials, books, periodicals, electronic resources, but I was fortunate to be able to cultivate a donor. So I did not use the existing general collection funds to fund artist books because I felt I had to demonstrate their value. And I have very much focused on books that are hands-on. I'm not building an archive of rare, specially printed, fine letterpress artist books. I want my books to be held and handled by students. So that's how I've been approaching the artist book collection. And we've also been looking at where our student body is going, so what types of student clubs, student societies. In the time that I've been at Puget Sound, the university has established a Center for Multicultural Engagement. We have student training and cultural competency, so I've integrated the books into those programs.
I think hopefully I've explained a little bit about our ad hoc collection and so on. I think the big question for us is how do we develop a method of radical collecting that involves other than people who know about art. Maybe I could spend a little second sort of telling you where we're at now with our thinking about it, and then you can say, no, that's not going to work, or oh, somebody's tried that, it's rubbish. So what we're thinking about is this group of people, maybe it might be a dozen people or whatever, that includes seeing things people, it includes recalcitrant board members who need to know about art, it includes artists, and it also includes those who have a radical perspective about capitalism in the art market and discriminatory ways that the systems work to exclude all the usual candidates, and how maybe what we're thinking about is a programme that might last a year or might last 18 months. It's about cultural literacy in terms of how the arts systems work and how collecting works. And that it might culminate in members of this team going to the studios of artists and artists recommending artists that we might buy, but not able to nominate themselves, but actually giving us a guide about who might be emerging, who we might go and visit, and then asking the team to advocate for particular artists to be bought. So particular artworks to be bought, and then thinking possibly about an exhibition where the public can hear our team advocating for particular works and then making a decision, or it might be a public vote about what should be taken into the Women's Library. And I think I'm conscious of, in 100 years' time or whatever, I would like it to be absolutely transparent how the Women's Library went about choosing work the first time that they had an opportunity to buy something, that we were going through it as a process, trying to look at how the mechanisms work. What I think would be fantastic and a brilliant outcome would be if the people who are involved in that project were better able to understand the mechanisms by which things join academic collections, mainstream collections, national collections, and how those things are ultimately ours, and what their relationship is as citizens to those artworks. So I think, I suppose, again, this is a sort of part of the way that we'd go about it. It would be about radicalising to a degree and encouraging people to sort of feel more able to claim artworks. So it's maybe not just about maybe acquiring one or two artworks. It's about the process of understanding how works are bought and how they're collected and how they end up in collections.
Okay, so I think we have a roving mic. Do we have any questions? And where is the mic? I'm not sure where it is.
Why the mic's roving, I did want to say that one aspect of collecting artist books is, representing and reflecting on purchasing student work, as well as looking at zines as an alternative, because that sometimes has a lower price point than some artist books. And we've also been looking at purchasing ephemera, like scouring eBay. For example, recently we did an exhibit on the Black Panthers, and so we were purchasing material that reflected that. But I love your example of doing the commissioned work.
Yeah.
That seems to me like something that would be very egalitarian to commission, not to commission, but to invite artists to participate, and then that becomes part of your collection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much for both of your talks. I thought were really interesting and wonderful, so thank you. My question is really about maybe events that you run and outreach, and how you go about advertising those events to make sure that you get the sort of diversity that you want to include in those events, and basically that.
Well, one aspect that I've been fortunate about is to build a community organization called Puget Sound Book Artists. So it started out as kind of grassroots, and now we have over 100 individuals. So that has been a great opportunity to connect. We have a very vibrant arts community in Tacoma, so we publish through the listservs. But most of the outreach to include the diverse groups that we're looking at is getting on the phone, calling, going to those community events and advocating, being out there in the community, and then working with our liaison or subject librarians to also be connected with the faculty. So it's multi-pronged.
In our case, I suppose I mentioned earlier on, just refer very briefly to the idea of, although we're a grown-up library now, there's still very many of us would say that we are still of the community, even though I might appear middle class. I don't know what you think about my class, but I live near the library, and others live near the. We have women from all different backgrounds, ethnicities, sexualities, ages, class histories, and so on within our cohort. So I mentioned about EDI being terrifically important to us, and I suppose one of the critical ways that it should be expressed is in your staff cohort. So if people are coming in and they have been volunteers with you, or they have come through a literacy strand, or they, but also I mentioned about the embedding of equalities before we even recruited our first collections professional. So having daily English as a second language classes means that you've got people in every day who are going to be interested in what's happening, or because we've got literacy learners in. Do you know what I mean? I think, but also we do have, if you go on our website, you'll see what our equality, diversity and inclusion plan and policy is. And we've still got lots of work to do, and we're working on it. So, but I think, as you say, Janet, I just feel like it's incredibly labour-intensive work, and there's no shortcutting. And it's labour-intensive because what we've inherited is absolutely massive perceptions of barriers. I mean, that's what we're up against. So the degree to which the institution you work with has built those barriers up, sometimes over centuries, is, that bears a relationship to how much work you'll have to do to get people through the door. Fortunately, we almost like our origin story was very different. We came from the grassroots. We had young lesbians, homeless people who've been involved in prostitution, all different people involved in our origin story. So it's like, well, there's thousands of people who know that we will look after their stuff and that we're not going to patronise them, or, that type of thing. I don't know if that's helpful, but...
It was, thank you.
Great.
So,
Hello, thank you both of you. That was amazing, both of your talks. Actually, I have a question for both of you. I hope that's okay. Jane, the output from those book design sessions were amazing. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the format of those sessions. How long were they? There seemed to be a lot of work in there. And and Adele, afterwards, do you mind saying a bit more about the Young Critic program you have?
Absolutely.
So the majority of our sessions are about 90 minutes. So that gives opportunity for individuals to personally look at the books and reflect, and then to have the group discussions, and then have the larger group sessions. In terms of the actual books that the students made, that's completely independent learning. So we do have a maker space in our library where we have like zine making workshops and like doing a basic pamphlet fold stitched book. We have lots of books on books, and then in our organization, the Puget Sound Book Artists, we generally offer 1 to 2 open seats for students that are interested in bookmaking. But that's what kind of just blew me away when we started this project, that these were students that had never done that before. And so it is kind of inspiring when all the speakers today talking about creativity. And a lot of students come into sessions and think, well, I'm a biology major. I can't possibly make a book. But they are, inspired, and that's really great.
And the Young Critics. The Young Critics was a time-limited project. It was one of those most loathed in terms of the structure of it, in that we knew that we'd got money for 2 years to develop a project with young people. But fortunately, it's continuing through young women volunteering with us and still being in our orbit. In fact, one of the before I go on to sort of mention a little bit more about its structure, one of the young women is actually on our board now, which is really amazing. And she's also, I think it's UK Graduate of the Year at the moment. I mean, she's just like scarily fantastic. But the Young Critics Project, I think we were aware that although what we've noticed, I mentioned this sort of like accelerated growth of the Women's Library over the last few years, and I think it's not surprising when you think about what's been happening politically and this sort of incredible resurgence of interest in feminism and the records of feminism. And I think over the last 5 years or so, younger women have overtaken older women in the volunteer cohort, which is really, really positive sign in terms of succession planning and everything else. But I think we felt that it would be great to have more young women articulating what they thought about our work, but also other work, but also mindful of the gender gap in terms of art criticism, and that women, really needed to get into publishing and editing and so on and so forth. So it was a great project. So we got professional writers, critics, bloggers, people came in and they did do training and you did develop expertise and so on. Now it's a lot more free form. So we have women who just basically get really hot under the collar about something and then just sort of decide, say, I've written a blog and I'm going to put it online, and we're like, whoa, wait a second. Yeah, I'm sure it can go on. Let's have a look at it first. But specifically, we're interested in linking it to the Seeing Things project. So I mentioned we go out and we do things. So it's almost like a similar format, but specifically looking at what young people might be interested in. They decided at the end of it to exhibit as well, and I thought that was a really great thing. I like having sketched an outline of a project if the participants are then defying the original plans and do go on and do other things and so on. So the slide that I showed you was a really beautiful exhibition that the young critics chose to stage.
Hi there, this is more targeted towards Jane. I'm currently working on a project about visualizing invisible illness. And what I've found is in trying to find the sources, they're not written by marginalised people, they're written about marginalised people by people that have no experience of that. Do you find it difficult to find sources about different groups of people because of the nature of the way they're segregated? I hope that makes sense.
No, that's a great question, and I think I'm hoping Joanna Drucker will also address that tomorrow, but I think just looking at the legacy of our collections and assessing where there are gaps and then being very proactive in trying to fill those gaps. And part of that, really just looking on eBay for documents, reaching out to community groups. An example, we have an organization in Tacoma called Centro Latino, and they have an archive of materials documenting the Latinx experience in Tacoma, and never thought to connect with the university or deposit those archives. So I do think there's the opportunity to just be out there engaging with your organizations in your community and trying to uncover those collections. I think this is where the digitized archives can be very helpful. So the example that I gave about the Japanese prison camps, we have the Japanese American Densho archives, which have digitized thousands of letters and personal narratives. So that's where I see also being able to bring in the voices that we might not have and create the conversations in the classroom with the digital and the print together. But it's definitely a challenge. We recently did a session on mental illness. Many of our students have anxiety and are suffering from depression and learning accessibility issues. And one of the students in the class made a book about that invisible illness. So I think that, again, that was a book that I purchased for the collection. And perhaps somebody would look at that and say, it's not particularly well made. It's not, maybe the tunnel doesn't lay flat, the covers don't come together, but it's really what it's saying, and it's the voice of that student. So I think again, I'm looking at 50 years from now when somebody comes back to this collection, did we tell the story of our students at Puget Sound? So that's a lot of what our collection is about too, like telling our story.
Thank you. I've got a question for Adele. Can you talk a bit more about the Seeing Project? Is that what you call it? The visits that you do with groups and the structure of that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a time-limited project in terms of funding, but actually it's been thriving since the funding has stopped. So we did have a facilitator, and basically what she did was she just talked to women, first of all, in the library, and then like gatekeepers beyond the library. So I think we spoke to Sexually Abused Young Women Project, Say Women Project, and various other projects that are in our locale. And we made sure that there was funding for, travel and so on and so forth, all the things that you would might, alleviate any barriers that people could think about. And to begin with, we were quite keen that we would be a bit directive about where the group went, because I think ARLIS, first of all, did some canvassing, and I think the first suggestion was like, let's go to the police museum, and we're like, no, let's go somewhere else first. So we were, it's uncharacteristic, but we were a bit directive. But we ended up taking groups to, maybe it would be like every fortnight to begin with. And we went to things like the Edinburgh International Book Festival, we went to Tramway, we just saw the most amazing things, the Louise Bourgeois show, like really challenging and fantastic stuff. And not knowing that for some women it might be not just the first time that they'd been to Edinburgh, which is only an hour away from Glasgow, but for some women they'd not been across the city, so they'd not been from the East End, where they lived, to the West End of the city. Which is, it's 5 minutes to the centre of town and then another 10 minutes walk to the West End. So it's just, West End is sort of where the university is and where the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery is and so on and so forth. I think some of my most, fulfilling moments are when learners have come in the library, or maybe those who had no experience of going to museums, who've been involved in seeing things, and then have come in, and they'll often deliver these little sort of anecdotes of like, I took my family off to see this, an artist who's a filmmaker, Margaret Salmond. I don't know if anybody knows her work. And she is exhibited recently at the Tramway. It's an incredibly wonderful conceptual work, but it's actually about Speedway. And it was just so brilliant that one of our literacy learners happens to be a mad Speedway fanatic and had been to the Tramway for some other really esoteric and interesting art work that we've been, and took her whole family to the Speedway thing that Margaret Salmond was doing. And but anyway, I think after a wee while, we did ask the participants to sort of programme. Now the way that it's led is that there's a whole team of our volunteers, because I mentioned that we've got 100 volunteers, and we could easily have that number of volunteers filled with young, fantastic students with a lot of cultural capital, who just want to put Women's Library on their CV, or they want to contribute, but they've already got masses of confidence and skills and so on. We love having some of those women in the mix, but our priority is to get people for whom this is going to be a seismic change. It's going to be like fast-tracking into cultural capital by mixing with and getting to know other people and being in our environment. So a lot of our volunteers are still people who've had really terrible episodes of mental health problems or bereavement or homelessness or whatever. And really, we're very much about having integrated learning happening, even though I mentioned that some of our things are specifically about literacy or whatever. It's really important that there's loads of things that people do together. So now, out of that volunteer cohort, some of those volunteers have offered to lead Seeing Things, and there's a posse of them, and they're absolutely brilliant. And I think one of the papers that happened this morning in one of the talks, I thought was really brilliant, was about I think it was Anne's paper, where she was talking about when the tutors are wrong-footed alongside the students, and that's the most successful moment when everybody's shocked and everybody's surprised. So we really try and make sure that the volunteers who are leading are going to things that they wouldn't normally go to. That it's not like, oh, I always go to transmission and I'm going to take them along and make them aware as I am about art. It's like, well, I've never been to the ballet or I've never been to this. I'll go and we'll all see what we think. So now it's a really healthy combo of suggestions coming from learners and participants and suggestions coming from volunteers who maybe have got a little bit more confidence in cultural capital.
Thank you.
No props.
Interesting.
Okay, so we only have a few more minutes just for one last question, if there is one.
I have one.
Okay.
I don't want to take it, but I'm just curious, when you started the organization, what did the Glasgow boys think of it?
Some of them are still smarting. Some of them are still pissed off. You know, some of them are still grumpy with us. But they'll get over it. And they're all right, you know, everything's cool. But yeah, I mean, it is obviously, my perspective is one perspective about the history. I was a co-founder of the library, and a lot of things get mythologised. I'm aware that my own, you know, stuff, it's very, very subjective memory. But it's, you know, people do, because you write things and you rail about things, and I personally was quite polemical and ill-judged in some of the things that I said back in 1990, and these things come back up like a horrible burp, and some people are around still, so, but I just sort of feel like, do you know what, all of us have made Glasgow a better place, you know, so it's all good, and there's been no fisticuffs or anything like that.
Well, please join me in thanking the speakers. It's been a really great talk. Thank you so much.